All women are different, but they are all women. This video is androcentric from a men's point of view and is presented as opinion, commentary, and debate. Expressing opinions is not violence. These are ideas to challenge, question, and argue in public, because classical liberalism relies on the First Amendment for its dialectic. If you are a feminist, then consider this. If patriarchy truly existed as claimed, feminism could not. And if all men are trash and women are equal to men, then what are we to conclude? Women will die for their children. Men will die for their wives and children, and God chose to die for all mankind. Authority rolls up with responsibility. If this framing of facts offends you, click off to a cute cat video. Proceeding further will expose you to gamma bias and criticism directed at ideas, claims, institutions, not at any individual's virtue or dignity. Our method follows the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and the transcendentals, the good, true, and beautiful. If this framework is not for you, feel free to exit now. It's no disgrace. Women are wonderful. God bless America. Men are great. Feminismus delendus est. Gay Race Gender Communism. Degeneracy über alles. Written by Conrad Riker. Available now. Links in description. The Safe Space Expropriation Exposed. How institutional dialectics replace natural law and how men rebuild ordered liberty. Compassion is the most powerful weapon ever aimed at the throat of civilization, because the compassionate lie disarms resistance before the victim knows he has been cut. Consider the Safe Space Expropriation, a revolution that did not arrive with guillotines, but with risk assessment forms, therapeutic vocabulary, and the smiling insistence that the state loves your children more than you do. Its high priestess, the academic activist whose entire career is a weaponized grievance against nature, declares the biological family a site of patriarchal hoarding and emotional violence, and demands that expert bureaus replace fathers with case managers. The bureaucratic machine then invents the category of the unsurviving parent, not a parent who has failed to keep a child alive, but a parent who has failed to conform to the state's evolving emotional standards. Standards no legislature debated, no voter approved, and no father can ever fully satisfy, because they are designed to be unfalsifiable. The child is removed not for a broken bone, but for a broken feelings protocol. And the father who protests discovers that his protest itself is entered as evidence of his danger. Here is the satanic inversion in its purest institutional form. Mercy replaces justice as the instrument of tyranny. The state claims to protect the vulnerable while destroying the one institution, the family that nature herself constructed for their protection. It calls this safety. It calls the father's authority risk. It calls the social worker's subjective intuition evidence. It calls the child's spiritual orphanhood liberation. Every word has been captured and reversed, every natural duty reclassified as a threat, every paternal instinct pathologized as control. The unsurviving father is not a man who abandoned his post. He is a man whose post was declared illegitimate by a therapeutically governed apparatus that recognizes no authority above its own evolving definitions of harm, and the child, physically sheltered in institutional care, is spiritually euthanized, taught that his origins were oppressive and his belonging must be earned through compliance to the regime that orphaned him. This is not child protection. It is the transfer of custody from the household to the hive, from covenant to casework, from the father who builds to the committee that manages. But natural law does not negotiate with committees, and the logos that ordered the cosmos does not recognize the authority of a risk protocol drafted by ideologues who deny that human nature exists. The family is prior to the state, not derived from it, not permitted by it, not improved by its supervision. Fatherhood and motherhood are not social constructs to be reprogrammed. They are offices of nature, grounded in teleology, confirmed by every civilization that endured long enough to write its wisdom down. The path back is neither nostalgia nor reaction, but restoration, the re-establishment of the household as sovereign territory, the return of due process to a system that currently treats accusation as proof. the reinstatement of objective truth against the tyranny of lived experience, and the recovery of the transcendental's truth, goodness, beauty, as the only architecture capable of holding a civilization together. What follows is that map, a syllogistic, etymological, and rhetorical campaign to name every demon of this therapeutic revolution, expose its contradictions, and rebuild the order it was designed to replace.
If the state can define safety to remove children from their parents, who defines the state's safety and at what cost to the soul of the child? Dr. Winona's Cultural Revolution article, by Dr. Winona, feminist Marxist, Ph.D.
Faculty of Critical Equity Studies, Institute for Applied Social Justice. The traditional nuclear family has long been sacralized in Western discourse as the natural unit of care, the irreducible atom of social order. This sacralization, we contend, is not an expression of timeless wisdom, but a defense mechanism. A pre-reflective ideological armor shielding patriarchal resource hoarding and the structural emotional violence embedded in paternal authority from critical examination. The family as currently constituted is not a sanctuary. It is a privatized regime of dependency in which the biological father functions as unelected sovereign, distributing protection and provision conditionally, extracting compliance and emotional labor as tribute, and weaponizing the language of love to secure what is, at bottom, a hierarchical arrangement of power. We do not say this lightly. Decades of critical scholarship have documented what we now must name plainly: the family is a site of harm, not universally, not uniformly, but structurally. The mere absence of visible bruises does not constitute safety. Emotional neglect, the silent tyranny of an absent or authoritarian father, the daily microaggressions of a household organized around paternal mood, these are harms. They register in the body, in the nervous system, in the lifelong patterns of the child who learns under the roof of the so-called safe home to disappear. It is here that the state's social services risk protocol enters not as intrusion but as grace. What critics call bureaucratic overreach, we recognize as compassionate surveillance, the disciplined, evidence-informed practice of intervening where harm is real but illegible to the criminal justice standard. We have evolved beyond the crude threshold of physical violence. We now understand that a child can be unsurviving in a home that appears stable. The term unsurviving is deliberate. It names a condition. The child who is technically housed, technically fed, technically supervised, yet whose interior life is collapsing under the weight of emotional deprivation, identity suppression. Or the ambient cruelty of a father whose love is inseparable from control. The unsurviving child is not dying visibly. The unsurviving child is dying legibly to those trained to read the text of suffering. The risk protocol is, in essence, an act of reading. It is a hermeneutic practice. Social workers trained in equity literacy and trauma-informed assessment enter homes not as adversaries, but as translators, translating the child's lived experience into a language the state can act upon. When we remove a child, we are not destroying a family, we are interrupting a pattern. The family reconstituted under therapeutic governance may yet be restored, but restoration must pass through accountability. This is where the anger directed at our protocol reveals its own logic. Those who denounce child removal as statist kidnapping operate from an unquestioned premise that biological parenthood confers ownership. It does not. Parenthood is a relationship of stewardship, not sovereignty when stewardship fails. When the father's presence produces measurable emotional deregulation in the child, the state's duty is not deference. The state's duty is the child. Critics will invoke due process. We answer, due process for whom? The father who demands his day in court is demanding the right to procedural comfort, while the child continues to unsurvive. The risk protocol operates on a different timeline, the timeline of the nervous system, not the docket. Therapeutic governance cannot wait for cross-examination. It must act on the best available reading of the child's lived experience, which is, we assert, a form of evidence older and more reliable than the adversarial standard. The child's body does not lie. The child's behavior does not litigate. We are aware, of course, that this framing unsettles those invested in what we call the naturalization fallacy, the assumption that because the biological family is ancient, it is optimal, but antiquity is not evidence. Slavery was ancient. Patriarchy is ancient. The question is not what is inherited, but what is just. And justice, properly understood, is not neutrality. Justice is intervention on behalf of the structurally powerless. Consider the data. Children in homes with rigid paternal authority structures show elevated rates of anxiety, identity suppression, and what our colleagues in developmental psychology now characterize as compliance trauma, the internalization of paternal expectation as self-erasure. These children do not report harm in the moment. They lack the vocabulary. It is only years later, in the therapeutic setting, that the unsurviving becomes articulate. By then, the damage is architectural. Our protocol exists to intervene before the architecture hardens. We acknowledge, indeed, we insist that this work requires a redefinition of safety. Safety is not the absence of violence. Safety is the presence of affirmation. A home without affirmation is not safe. A father who provides materially but withdraws emotionally is not protective. A mother who is herself surviving under paternal coercion cannot be the child's sole safeguard. This is not a failure of the mother. It is a structural condition that the therapeutic state exists to remedy. We are building slowly and deliberately a world in which no child's well-being is contingent on the goodwill of an unaccountable biological sovereign. The social services risk protocol is the leading edge of this project. It substitutes institutional care, professional, accountable, equity literate, for the lottery of birth. It replaces the father's private judgment with the collective expertise of the caring professions. And yes, it claims jurisdiction over the home because the home is where power is most private and most absolute. We anticipate the objection, who watches the watchers? We answer with transparency. The protocol is publicly codified. Our social workers are trained, supervised, and accountable to professional standards. Our interventions are reviewed. What our critics cannot accept is not that the protocol is unaccountable. It is that the protocol is accountable to the child, not to the father. And that redirection of accountability from patriarchal privacy to therapeutic public reason is the revolution itself. This is the horizon, a society in which childhood is not a dependency to be endured, but a condition to be actively safeguarded by institutions that see. The family may yet have a role, but it will be a role redefined, deprivatized, desovereignized, open to the gaze of care. The unsurviving child demands nothing less, and the state at last is listening. The counter-revolution, the revolution wearing a white coat. Every revolution needs a costume. The Jacobins wore the Phrygian cap, the Bolsheviks wore the leather jacket. The cultural revolutionaries of our moment wear the lanyard, the clipboard, and the therapy sweater. Dr.
Winona feminist Marxist's article, The Safe Space Expropriation, Toward a Therapeutic Architecture of Childhood Liberation, is a specimen of the genre.
It is the revolution dressed in clinical white, speaking the language of care while reaching for the most intimate lever of power, the relationship between parent and child. It does not announce itself as tyranny. It announces itself as grace. That is what makes it dangerous. Read the piece carefully. Not with outrage. Outrage is what the revolution consumes for fuel. Read it with grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the three arts of the trivium, which were forged in the academies of antiquity precisely to disarm sophistry of this kind. The article's grammar is clinical. Its logic is circular. Its rhetoric is designed to make you feel cruel for noticing. The thesis is straightforward once you strip the jargon. The family is a site of structural harm. The state is the remedy, and the father is the obstacle. The word unsurviving is doing heavy lifting here. It is a manufactured term, a neologism designed to expand the definition of harm until it encompasses everything and nothing. A child who is fed, housed, and supervised can be declared unsurviving on the basis of subjective emotional readings by state agents. The word is not analytical, it is theological. It creates a class of invisible victims whose suffering can only be perceived by an initiated priesthood, the equity-literate social worker who translates the child's lived experience into state action. Notice the architecture of the argument. The father is unelected sovereign. The home is a privatized regime of dependency. The state's intervention is compassionate surveillance. Every phrase inverts reality. The father who labors to feed his children is recast as a tyrant extracting tribute. The mother who nurtures is a victim of paternal coercion. The bureaucrat who removes a child without evidence is an instrument of grace. This is not analysis, it is incantation. The article does what revolutionary rhetoric always does. It takes the ordinary good and necessary structures of civilized life and paints them as oppression, so that their destruction can be presented as liberation. The revolution is not coming for you with guillotines. It is coming with a risk assessment form and a concern for your child's nervous system too. The dialectic trick to understand what Dr.
Winona's article is doing, you must understand the dialectical mechanism behind it. This is not a novel theory.
It is a well-worn engine that has been running since the 19th century. And it works the same way every time. Here is the mechanism in its bare structure. Thesis: there is an inherited order, the family, sexed roles, parental authority, customary law. This order is not perfect because nothing human is perfect. But it has survived because it functions. It raises children, transmits culture, and organizes care without requiring a totalitarian state. Antithesis: critical theory identifies the imperfections in this order and magnifies them into structural violence. The father who disciplines becomes the father who traumatizes. The mother who sacrifices becomes the mother who is coerced. The home becomes a site of harm. The language shifts from describing problems within the order to describing the order itself as the problem. Synthesis: the state intervenes, not to abolish the family outright, that would create resistance. Instead, the state redefines the family's terms of operation. It sets the criteria for safety. It trains the professionals who assess risk. It determines which parental behaviors qualify as affirming and which constitute neglect. The family still exists in name, but its sovereignty has been transferred to the therapeutic bureaucracy. A new baseline is established, then the cycle repeats. The next crisis requires deeper intervention.
The next redefinition of harm captures more families. The next expansion of compassionate surveillance reaches further into the home. Dr. Winona's article is the antithesis stage dressed as the synthesis stage.
It is the theoretical justification for what is already happening in family courts, social services agencies, and school counseling programs across the Western world. Here is how the trick works in practice. First, concept creep. The word safety once meant freedom from physical danger. Now it means the presence of affirmation. A home without affirmation is declared unsafe. But affirmation according to whom? According to the state's equity framework, which has its own definitions of what constitutes a healthy emotional environment, definitions that are ideological, not empirical. Second, problem, reaction, solution. A genuine problem, child abuse, neglect, real suffering, is universalized because some fathers are cruel. All fatherhood is treated as structurally suspect. Because some homes are dangerous, the home itself is recast as a privatized regime. The reaction is moral panic. The solution is bureaucratic expansion. Third, the ersatz substitute. The state does not merely remove the child from harm. It substitutes its own institutional care for the family. Foster systems, therapeutic programs, and social service bureaucracies replace the organic bonds of kinship. The substitute is always inferior. The data on outcomes for children in state care is unambiguous. But the ideology requires the substitute to be presented as superior, because the ideology's survival depends on the family's demotion. Fourth, repressive tolerance. Dissent from this process is recast as harm. The father who demands due process is demanding procedural comfort, while the child continues to unsurvive. The parent who questions the social worker's assessment is exhibiting fragility. The critic who cites evidence is invested in the naturalization fallacy. Disagreement is pathologized. The revolution does not debate, it diagnoses. This is the dialectical trick. It manufactures a crisis, redefines the terms of resolution, installs the bureaucratic substitute, and silences opposition by framing it as cruelty. It has been deployed against every inherited institution of Western civilization: the church, the university, the guild, the constitution, the family. The mechanism is always the same: The target rotates. 3.
The vector map away from natural law. Dr. Winona's article is not a single argument.
It is a bundle of inversions, each one a vector pointing away from the natural order that Western civilization inherited, refined, and transmitted across millennia. Let us map the most critical vectors. Vector 1, fatherhood, from stewardship to threat. The inversion, fatherhood, is redefined from a covenantal office of provision, protection, and moral formation into a potential threat that must be monitored by the therapeutic state. The article calls the father an unelected sovereign who distributes protection and provision conditionally and weaponizes the language of love. Every father who has ever set rules, enforced bedtimes, or said no to his child recognizes this framing. It takes the ordinary duties of paternal care and recasts them as instruments of control. The etymology is revealing. The Latin pater gives us both father and pattern. The father is the one who establishes the pattern, the moral architecture within which the child learns to navigate reality. This is not tyranny, it is pedagogy. The Greek paideia, the education of the child into virtue, depends on paternal authority, because authority is what makes standards stick. A father who cannot enforce rules cannot teach character. A father who cannot say no cannot teach discernment. The article's inversion dissolves the paternal office entirely. The father becomes a biological sovereign whose authority is inherently suspect. His stewardship is replaced by the social worker's assessment. His judgment is overridden by the child's lived experience, which is, conveniently, only legible to the trained professional. The magnitude, 9/10. This is civilizational. No society in history has survived the systematic delegitimization of fatherhood. The data is unambiguous. Fatherlessness correlates with every social pathology the therapeutic state claims to address: poverty, crime, mental illness, academic failure, addiction. The revolution does not solve these problems. It manufactures them by removing fathers and then expanding to manage the wreckage. The restoration principle. Fatherhood as the pillar of justice and provision, grounded in natural law. The father's office is not a social construct. It is a teleological reality rooted in the nature of the human family. The state's role is to support this office, not to replace it, and to intervene only when the father has demonstrably failed in his duty, not when his parenting style offends the sensibilities of an equity-trained caseworker. Vector 2, motherhood, from pre-political foundation to state adjunct. The inversion, maternal care, is redefined as insufficient without state oversight. The mother who nurtures is recast as a victim of paternal coercion, who cannot be the child's sole safeguard. The article is clever here. It does not attack motherhood directly, it subsumes it. The mother is not an agent in her own right. She is a dependent of the therapeutic state, which must supplement her care with professional surveillance. A mother who is herself surviving under paternal coercion cannot be the child's sole safeguard. The implication is that maternal instinct is unreliable, maternal love is compromised, and maternal authority must be validated by the state's equity literacy. This is satanic inversion in its purest form. The mother, the pre-political foundation of all human care. The person whose bond with the child precedes every institution, every law. Every state is reduced to an adjunct who requires professional certification to be deemed competent. The magnitude, 8/10. The attack on motherhood is less visible than the attack on fatherhood, but it is equally devastating. When the state positions itself as the ultimate guarantor of the child's welfare, it does not elevate the mother. It infantilizes her. She becomes another client of the system, supervised, assessed, and corrected by bureaucrats whose own parenting track records are never subjected to scrutiny. The restoration principle, motherhood as the pre-political foundation of care, recognized as prior to and superior to state intervention. The maternal bond is not a social construct. It is written into biology, into the 9 months of gestation, into the neurochemistry of attachment, into the entire architecture of mammalian life. The state does not create this bond. The state cannot replace it. And when the state pretends to replace it, children suffer in ways that no risk protocol can measure. Vector 3, justice, from due process to therapeutic intuition. The inversion, due process, is replaced by therapeutic intuition. Evidence becomes secondary to felt experience. The presumption of innocence is inverted into a presumption of parental guilt. Read this passage from the article carefully. Due process for whom the father who demands his day in court is demanding the right to procedural comfort while the child continues to unsurvive. The risk protocol operates on a different timeline, the timeline of the nervous system, not the ducat. Therapeutic governance cannot wait for cross-examination.
This is the most honest passage in the entire article, and it is the most terrifying. Dr. Winona is explicitly arguing that due process is a luxury the state cannot afford.
The traditional instruments of justice, evidence, cross-examination, the presumption of innocence, the right to face one's accuser, are dismissed as procedural comfort. The state must act on the best available reading of the child's lived experience, which is determined not by a judge or jury, but by a social worker trained in equity literacy. Magna Carta, Article 39, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. That principle, born from the Western canon's long struggle against arbitrary power, is precisely what Dr.
Winona's protocol dismantles. It replaces the lawful judgment of his equals with the therapeutic judgment of a credentialed class. It replaces the law of the land with the protocol of the agency.
The magnitude, 7/10 and rising, every family court proceeding that operates on the presumption that the father is dangerous until proven safe. Every child protection investigation that treats accusation as evidence. Every school policy that allows a counselor to affirm a child's identity without parental knowledge, all of these are fruits of this vector. The restoration principle, due process, as the non-negotiable foundation of justice, evidence-based adjudication, the presumption of parental right, clear standards of proof. The understanding earned across centuries of blood and tyranny that it is better to let a guilty man go free than to build a system that destroys innocent families on the basis of therapeutic intuition. Vector 4, truth, from objective reality to lived experience. The inversion, objective truth, is replaced by lived experience as the arbiter of reality. Facts become subordinate to ideological conformity. Falsifiability is abandoned. The article asserts that the social worker's reading of the child's lived experience is a form of evidence older and more reliable than the adversarial standard. This is not a claim. It is a theological assertion. It cannot be tested. It cannot be falsified. It demands acceptance on faith, faith in the social worker's training, in the equity framework's validity, and the proposition that subjective interpretation is superior to empirical investigation. This is the postmodern move. Truth equals power. The social worker's interpretation is true because the social worker holds institutional power. The father's counter-evidence is irrelevant because the father lacks interpretive authority. The child's nervous system is invoked as an oracle, a private revelation accessible only to the initiated, and the demand for corroborating evidence is recast as hostility. Consider the article's treatment of data. It cites elevated rates of anxiety, identity suppression, and compliance trauma in homes with rigid paternal authority structures. But these categories are self-defining within the ideology. Compliance trauma is a concept generated by the same theoretical framework that defines paternal authority as harmful. The theory cannot lose. If the child is anxious, the father caused it. If the child is compliant, the father caused that too. If the child rebels, the father's rigidity produced the rebellion. Every outcome confirms the premise. This is not science. It is circular reasoning dressed in clinical language. The magnitude 8/10. When truth collapses, everything collapses. Without objective standards of evidence, there is no limit to what the state can justify. The risk protocol becomes whatever the protocol's authors say it is. The definition of harm expands without limit. The definition of safety contracts until only the therapeutic state itself qualifies as safe. The restoration principle, logos, objective truth, exists independent of perception. Reality is not negotiable. Science and reason, not standpoint epistemology, are the basis for policy. A claim that cannot be falsified is not a claim, it is a dogma. and a state that operates on unfalsifiable dogmas is not a republic. It is a theocracy, and its god is the bureaucracy. Vector 5, safety from physical protection to emotional affirmation. The inversion, safety is redefined from the absence of physical danger to the presence of affirmation. This redefinition justifies unlimited state intervention in the home. This single semantic move is the keystone of the entire revolution. If safety means no physical harm, the state's jurisdiction is limited and clear. If safety means the presence of affirmation, the state's jurisdiction is unlimited because affirmation is infinitely subjective and infinitely expandable. What affirms one child may not affirm another. What constitutes affirmation today may not constitute affirmation tomorrow. The definition shifts with the ideology, and the ideology always shifts toward more control. The article is explicit. Safety is not the absence of violence. Safety is the presence of affirmation. A home without affirmation is not safe. This is not a redefinition, it is an expropriation. The word safety has been stolen from its common meaning and repurposed as an instrument of ideological expansion. Every parent who fails to affirm, according to the state's current standard, is now a risk. Every home that does not meet the therapeutic criteria is now unsafe. This is concept creep weaponized. The word safety triggers an emotional response. No one wants children to be unsafe, and that response is used to bypass rational evaluation of the policy. The parent who objects is framed as opposing child safety. The critic who demands evidence is framed as indifferent to suffering. The word does the work that the argument cannot. The magnitude, 9/10. This vector is the engine of the entire project. Without the redefinition of safety, none of the other inversions can function. The state cannot remove children for emotional neglect, unless emotional neglect is defined as broadly as the ideology requires. The state cannot override parental authority unless safety is expanded to include ideological conformity. The redefinition of safety is not a policy adjustment. It is a revolution in the relationship between the state and the family. The restoration principle, safety, as freedom from physical danger with clear evidentiary standards. Emotional well-being is important, no one denies this, but it cannot serve as the basis for state intervention without objective criteria. The presence of affirmation is a theological category, not a legal one, and it has no place in a framework that claims to govern by reason rather than revelation. IV, legal positivism, and the Nuremberg warning. There is a warning embedded in the legal philosophy of the West, and it comes from the most catastrophic failure of Western civilization in the 20th century. At Nuremberg, the Nazi officials defended themselves with a simple argument: they had followed the law. The statutes of the Third Reich authorized their actions. The courts of the Third Reich ratified their decisions. The bureaucracy of the Third Reich processed their paperwork. They had done nothing illegal. They had complied with the legal framework of their state. The tribunal rejected this defense. It established a principle that is now foundational to the Western legal tradition. Positive law, the law enacted by the state, is not sufficient to establish justice. A law can be legal and unjust. A command can be authorized and evil. A procedure can be followed and criminal. When the state's laws contradict natural law, the moral order that precedes and supersedes human legislation, obedience to those laws is not a defense. This is the Nuremberg warning, and it applies directly to doctrine.
Winona's Risk Protocol. The protocol operates within its own legal positivist framework. It follows its own rules. Its social workers are trained, supervised, and accountable to professional standards.
Its interventions are publicly codified. By every internal measure, the protocol is legal. It has the right forms, the right signatures, the right institutional backing. But legality is not justice. The social services bureaucracy that removes children from loving homes on the basis of subjective emotional readings is acting within its own legal framework, and its actions are unjust because they invert natural law. The state's legal authority to seize children does not confer moral legitimacy on the destruction of the family. A protocol is not a moral argument. A procedure is not a proof. A regulation is not a revelation. The Nuremberg warning cuts through the therapeutic state's most powerful defense, the claim that it is merely following procedure. So were the bureaucrats of every totalitarian regime in history.
The question is not whether the procedure was followed. The question is whether the procedure is just. Dr. Winona's article never asks this question.
It assumes that the state's definition of justice is identical to justice itself. It assumes that the protocol's criteria for intervention are identical to the criteria for right action. It assumes that the social worker's interpretation of the child's lived experience is identical to truth. These assumptions are legal positivism in its purest form, the belief that the state's law is the highest law, that the state's definitions are the final definitions, and that compliance with the state's procedures absolves the state of moral responsibility. Nuremberg was convened specifically to reject this belief. The West paid for that rejection in millions of lives. We dishonor their memory if we forget it now. What must be restored? The counter-revolution is not a matter of electing better politicians or reforming a specific agency. It is a matter of restoring the civilizational architecture that the revolution has systematically dismantled. What follows is not a wish list, it is a blueprint. Restore the family as the primary unit of society. The family is prior to the state. It exists before the Constitution, before the legislature, before the bureaucracy. The state does not create the family. The state does not define the family. The state's role is to protect the family's integrity, not to supervise its emotional life. The principle of subsidiarity, which the Western canon inherited from the scholastic tradition and the civic practice of self-governing communes, holds that decisions should be made at the lowest competent level. The family is the lowest competent level for child rearing. The state is the highest and least competent. The revolution has inverted this hierarchy. The counter-revolution must restore it. Restore due process. Evidence-based adjudication, the presumption of parental right, clear standards of proof, the right to face one's accuser, the right to cross-examine. The understanding, hard-won across centuries of struggle, that accusation is not evidence, feeling is not fact, and the burden of proof rests on the party seeking to disrupt the family. Every one of these principles exists in the Western legal tradition. Every one of them has been eroded by the therapeutic state. Every one of them can be restored, but only if men have the courage to demand them. Restore objective truth. Reality exists independent of perception. A child's lived experience is important, but it is not self-interpreting, and it is not immune to distortion, coaching, or ideological capture. Claims must be falsifiable. Evidence must be empirical. The postmodern assertion that truth is a function of power is not a philosophical insight. It is a license for tyranny, because it removes the only constraint that can hold the state accountable, the existence of a reality beyond the state's control. Restore the transcendentals. Truth, goodness, and beauty are not emotional utilities. They are the foundations of civilization. Truth is not whatever makes you feel safe. Goodness is not whatever the state affirms. Beauty is not whatever soothes. These categories must be restored to their proper place as the orienting principles of culture, education, and law, not as instruments of emotional management, but as reflections of an order that precedes human preference. Restore the Western canon. The canon, Greek logic, Roman law, Judeo-Christian theology, the scholastic synthesis, the Enlightenment's defense of individual rights. The common law's protection of due process is not a museum piece. It is the operating system of civilization. It contains the tools to detect and resist every form of tyranny, including the therapeutic kind. The revolution knows this, which is why it has worked so hard to dismantle the canon's transmission. The counter-revolution must rebuild it in homes, in schools, in churches, in brotherhoods, in any institution willing to carry the inheritance. Restore virtue. Prudence, the practical wisdom to judge rightly in particular cases, justice, the habit of giving each his due fortitude, the courage to act on principle under pressure. Temperance, the mastery of appetite by reason. These are not abstractions, they are trained capacities developed through practice, repetition, and discipline. A society of virtuous citizens does not need a therapeutic state. A society that has abandoned virtue cannot survive without one, and will not survive even with one. Restore limits on state power. The state has an appetite that grows with every feeding, every expansion of jurisdiction, every new category of harm, Every additional risk protocol increases that appetite. The Western canon's answer to this problem is constitutional, the mixed constitution, the separation of powers, the rule of law, the principle that the state is subject to limits it cannot set for itself. The therapeutic state has bypassed these limits by operating through administrative agencies that combine legislative, executive, and judicial functions in a single bureaucracy. The counter-revolution must restore the separation of powers and subject the administrative state to the same constitutional constraints that govern every other branch. Fix. The counter-revolutionary method. Restoration requires method, not merely intention. The revolution is systematic. The counter-revolution must be more systematic still. Define terms relentlessly. When the revolution says safety, ask safety from what? According to whom, measured how, by what standard? When the revolution says harm, ask physical or emotional, demonstrated or asserted, verified or assumed. When the revolution says affirmation, ask affirmation of what? By whose definition? What happens when definitions conflict? The revolution thrives on ambiguity. Clarity is its enemy. Every undefined term is a lever the revolution can pull. Pin every meaning to the wall and refuse to let it move. Demand falsifiability. If a claim cannot be disproven, it is not a claim. It is a dogma. Ask, what evidence would cause you to revise this position? If the answer is none, you are not dealing with science. You are dealing with religion, and a religion that demands the power of the state is not a religion. It is a tyranny. Apply the sex swap test. If a mother demanded standards, boundaries, and authority over her child's upbringing, would it be called empowerment? If a father demands the same, why is it called control? If a woman's preference for her own children is called maternal instinct, why is a man's preference for his own children called possessiveness? Virtue requires the same act, the same standard, the same evidence, regardless of the sex of the person performing it. The revolution depends on asymmetrical standards. Restore symmetry, and the revolution collapses. Separate harm from offense. Harm is demonstrable injury. Offense is subjective discomfort. The revolution conflates the two to expand its jurisdiction. A father who sets rules his child dislikes has caused offense, not harm. A social worker who removes a child from a loving home has caused harm, not safety. The distinction must be policed with relentless precision because the revolution's power depends on erasing it. Expose circular reasoning. The revolution's core argument is paternal authority produces harm. Harm proves paternal authority is dangerous. The premise and the conclusion are identical. The theory cannot lose because it has defined every possible outcome as confirmation. When you encounter this structure, name it, show the circle. Ask what evidence could break it. The silence that follows is the sound of an ideology encountering a question it cannot answer. Refuse collective guilt. Some fathers are abusive. Therefore, all fatherhood is structurally suspect. This is the composition fallacy, and it is the revolution's favorite move. Name it, reject it. Demand that every accusation be evaluated on its own evidence, not on the basis of a category to which the accused belongs. The West spent centuries establishing the principle of individual judgment. The revolution has repealed it in a single generation. Repeal the repeal. Identify the power transfer.
Every revolutionary proposal involves a transfer of power from one party to another. Dr. Winona's protocol transfers power from parents to social workers, from families to agencies.
From the private sphere to the bureaucratic sphere. Ask every time, who gains power? Who loses it? What is the cost? Who pays it? The revolution always presents itself as compassion. Follow the power and the compassion dissolves into control. Stay strategic. The revolution has institutional capture, universities, agencies, courts, media, professional associations. The counter-revolution does not have these institutions. It has something more durable, the truth, the canon, the family, and the accumulated wisdom of millennia. But truth without strategy is wasted. Choose battles carefully. Win arguments cleanly. Build alternative institutions. Train the next generation. Do not engage the revolution on its terms. Engage it on the terms the revolution cannot control: evidence, logic, natural law, and the stubborn reality of human nature. Sev, the question that breaks the spell. There is one question that Dr.
Winona's article cannot answer. It is the question that every revolutionary framework cannot answer, because answering it honestly would dissolve the framework.
If the state can define safety to remove children from their parents, who defines the state's safety and at what cost to the soul of the child? The protocol assumes that the social worker's judgment is reliable. But who judges the social worker? The article says the protocol is publicly codified. Our social workers are trained, supervised, and accountable to professional standards. But those standards are set by the same institutions that produce the protocol. The accountability is internal. The oversight is circular. The state has made itself the judge of its own competence, and it has declared itself competent. This is the structure of every unaccountable power in history. The king who judged the king's court. The party that reviewed the party's decisions, the Inquisition that investigated the Inquisition's methods. The form changes, the structure does not power. That is accountable only to itself is not accountability.
It is sovereignty, and Dr. Winona's article has the honesty to say so. This is the revolution itself. Yes, it is. And like every revolution, it will produce children.
Not the children it claims to protect. Those children become statistics in a foster system whose outcomes are catastrophic. The children it produces are the spiritual orphans of the therapeutic state. Technically housed, technically supervised, technically affirmed and stripped of the organic bonds that make human life human. The article ends with a sentence of unintentional prophecy, and the state at last is listening. The state is always listening. That is what the state does. The question is whether anyone is listening to the state, critically, carefully, with the full arsenal of Western reason, and saying clearly and without apology, no, the family is not yours, the child is not your client. The father is not your suspect, the mother is not your dependent, the home is not your jurisdiction, safety is not whatever you say it is, truth is not whatever you feel, and justice is not whatever your protocol produces. The Western canon, from the logic of the Greeks to the law of the Romans, from the theology of the scholastics to the rights of Englishmen, from the natural law of the philosophers to the common sense of free men, stands against this. It has stood for millennia. It will stand for millennia more, if men have the discipline to carry it. Virtue is trained power ordered to the good. The ancient masters are not dead. They are waiting for men disciplined enough to understand them. Counter-revolution cards. Card 1, motherhood and ordered care. Capture, the state defines safety not as physical protection, but as emotional comfort, allowing non-maternal agents to override biological mothers. Counterfeit, maternal instinct replaced by bureaucratic risk assessment test. Ask what the key word meant before the policy captured it, what evidence would falsify the claim, who gains power, and whether the rule applies reciprocally. Restoration, motherhood as the pre-political foundation of care, recognized as superior to state intervention unless physical danger is evident. Practice, separate harm from offense, evidence from interpretation, mercy from permissiveness, and law from mere procedure. Then rebuild the local rule around truth, proportion, appeal, and responsibility. Card 2, fatherhood and stewardship. Capture, the unsurviving father is any male who does not conform to the therapeutic state's definition of emotional availability, justifying his exclusion from decision-making. Counterfeit, fatherhood redefined from stewardship to potential threat test. Ask what the key word meant before the policy captured it. What evidence would falsify the claim, who gains power, and whether the rule applies reciprocally. Restoration, fatherhood as the pillar of justice and provision, grounded in natural law and the duty to protect and provide. Practice, separate harm from offense, evidence from interpretation, mercy from permissiveness, and law from mere procedure. Then rebuild the local rule around truth, proportion, appeal, and responsibility. Card 3, justice and due process. Capture, evidence is secondary to the felt experience of the child or the social worker. Truth is subjective and determined by power dynamics. Counterfeit, due process replaced by therapeutic intuition test. Ask what the key word meant before the policy captured it. What evidence would falsify the claim, who gains power, and whether the rule applies reciprocally. Restoration, Magna Carta due process, evidence-based adjudication, presumption of parental right, and clear standards of proof. Practice, separate harm from offense, evidence from interpretation, mercy from permissiveness, and law from mere procedure. Then rebuild the local rule around truth, proportion, appeal, and responsibility. Card 4. Truth and falsifiability. Capture critical theory's assertion that power determines truth. The state's narrative of systemic harm overrides empirical data on family stability. Counterfeit. Truth replaced by lived experience and identity test. Ask what the key word meant before the policy captured it. What evidence would falsify the claim who gains power? And whether the rule applies reciprocally. Restoration, logos, and objective truth. Reality exists independent of perception, science and reason as the basis for policy. Practice. Separate harm from offense, evidence from interpretation, mercy from permissiveness, and law from mere procedure. Then rebuild the local rule around truth, proportion, appeal, and responsibility. Card 5. Beauty and the Transcendentals. Capture, the safe space aesthetic replaces the sublime. Art and culture are judged by their ability to soothe rather than challenge or elevate. Counterfeit. Beauty reduced to comfort and safety test. Ask what the key word meant before the policy captured it. What evidence would falsify the claim? Who gains power and whether the rule applies reciprocally? Restoration. The Transcendentals as the foundation of civilization. Beauty as a reflection of divine order and truth. Practice. Separate harm from offense, evidence from interpretation, mercy from permissiveness, and law from mere procedure. Then rebuild the local rule around truth, proportion, appeal, and responsibility. One rule to carry. The rule is simple. The counter-revolution is constructive restoration, not mere negation. Define the captured word, identify the counterfeit good, restore the natural law principle, and rebuild the institution around truth rather than appetite. The revolutionary method steals good words such as safety, equity, inclusion, and justice, then uses them to smuggle in control. The restoration method gives the words back their proper boundaries. Safety protects real persons from real harm. Justice gives each his due. Mercy follows truth, and law answers to a standard higher than procedure. Carry the final question into the institution and make it stand still. If the state can define safety to remove children from their parents, who defines the state's safety and at what cost to the soul of the child? Sponsored book, Gay Race Gender Communism, Degeneracy, Uber alles. Look around, our civilization is rotting. Everywhere you turn, leftist ideology poisons minds, destroys institutions, and attacks the foundations that made the West great. I've watched it happen. I've seen friends lose jobs for speaking truth. I've seen universities become indoctrination camps. I've seen men demonized, history rewritten, and perversion celebrated as progress. This isn't an accident. It's a coordinated assault. And it's driven by forces most people don't understand. This book exposes that assault. It tears apart the lies, the word games, and the psychological pathologies fueling this madness. We dissect the woke vocabulary in Word Games 101, showing how terms like equity mask tyranny. We trace the roots of this insanity to a maternal wiring in the maternal matrix, revealing how female psychological patterns distort politics into a war between infants and predators. Infants get coddled. Predators get taxed. Sound familiar? In the pathology pipeline, we prove the direct link between mental illness and social justice activism, backed by hard data. Leftists aren't just wrong. They're often clinically unwell. If you value logic, truth, and the Western canon, if you revere the Greeks, the Christians, and the Enlightenment, this book is your weapon. It's for men who refuse to be silenced, who see through the emotional manipulation, and who fight to reclaim reality. We show how equity's iron fist crushes freedom. We expose the degeneracy celebration that calls depravity virtue. We dismantle the grievance industrial complex manufacturing victims for profit. And we reveal the narcissism epidemic, turning self-worship into a religion. Don't expect flattery. Don't expect apologies. This book names the enemy, the toxic blend of Marxism, feminism, and cultural nihilism killing our society. It traces this poison from its origins to its current stranglehold. If you're a man seeking truth, ready to arm yourself with unassailable arguments, read on. But if you're easily offended, if you believe feelings over facts, or if you think men are the problem, put this down now. Go knit a sweater. Watch reality TV. This isn't for you, you've been warned. For the rest of us, the fight starts here. Gay Race, Gender, Communism, Degeneracy, Über alles. Written by Conrad Riker. Buy now. Links in description.